All right, we've only got 2 people. I just started the stream. It should be coming up. I think this is going to come together. Oh no, what did I do? There we go. There's that. So the stream should be up. It should be recording and streaming. I'm sort of waiting for someone to come into the live stream that's occurring. I didn't have the title for this, but I'm not worried about that. As we're coming in, this is recording. So for those of you that are coming into this, I'm going to cover the rest of the material. I'm going to try and do that quickly. For those of you that are in, right, that's great too. But as we're coming through, because right now I don't have any viewers. I don't like this. So right now, for those of you that are in the WebEx, you should just be seeing the PowerPoint and the and my face, right? That's all you should be seeing. I don't see the same thing that you see. So if you are seeing something different, just let me know. Not that I'm hiding anything, it's just the YouTube chat and sort of a check that's there, but it's very confusing the way it's set up. And then as we're going through, if you have trouble hearing me, this is all running through one thing. Right now it's one computer, so I like that, but it means if there's anything wrong, it's this computer that I have to work with. All right, I do have someone watching. So if the person watching the YouTube could just sort of message me and make sure that they can hear, just let me know that you have some audio, and then we'll get started with the people that are here. I always give it a few minutes, but the fact that only 3 people are here when the class starts, unless I have the wrong start time, is kind of problematic, but I'm a little less worried about that right now. All right, perfect. Okay, so everyone can see the slides at this point. You should be able to see the slides. If not, I know the YouTube, it looks a little weird, but when I change, the best part is when I change in the WebEx, it changes, so it's all synced up. So I'm really excited about that. One computer, one setup. You guys can hear me. So let's just get into the material I'm going to cover, and then I want to try and do a review, and I think people just have to come in as they come in. I mean, everyone knows I'm going to be streaming right now, so we're getting people in here. Okay. The very first thing is you will have an exam pop up after this class. It's ready. It's essay only. I know I'm going to get a lot of questions about it. You have all week. There's no time limit. You have all week. So if you're watching this recording, you're watching this now, and you have questions, email me. I sort of got a few questions here and there, but I check all my emails. I check the web campus pretty regularly. I did not get any emails from students. So if you emailed me, it didn't come through. There are some tech issues, but for the most part, I think we're there. When you're doing this exam, one of the big things I want you to consider, the biggest thing that I want you to consider, is there's no one right answer. Right? Remember that this first exam is about how well you understand the science of comparative politics. And the thing about the science of comparative politics, right, we read going into this, Scotch, Poll, and Geddes, they disagree. But why am I having you read Scotch, Poll, and Geddes? Because for decades now, right, easily starting in the 1990s at least, right, so now we're talking about 3 decades of this, this has been a really great debate. We like to talk about Scotch, Poll, and Geddes. They talk to each other, right? They talk about each other, and they're really talking about some arguments that are really sound. And we'll talk about this as we move through. One of the things that is really important as we're discussing this is that they both have valid arguments. And when they're talking about it, they give very different reasons for why they're choosing their cases, and both of them have merit. They both have scientific validity, right? Internal validity. right? Geddes is like, look, if you look at other cases, you could miss things. And that's a very valid critique of Scotchpole, and we'll come back to that later. But when we're talking about Scotchpole, she says, yes, there are other cases and there are things, but I want to find the things that are unique. A lot of times when we're talking about political science, a social revolution is very, very rare. So if I say, let's look at all the cases and let's see, just look at what factors were there, and then we'll include cases that didn't exist and they didn't exist, in a large N data set, when we're doing statistics, that makes sense. But in a small N data set, when you only have a few cases to look at, and you're not doing this quantitatively, but you're looking at it qualitatively, where you're sort of comparing these cases, one, you just can't do all of this stuff. You can't, another thing is she didn't have access, I mean, she did have access, but she didn't use Latin America for a reason. She wanted to use, late 19th, early 20th century revolutions, because she wanted to talk about this transitional phase. She wanted to talk about this transformation. And her book is still assigned in tons and tons of courses because of that. She had a very valid reason for choosing those cases and excluding other cases purposefully. And she explained those in her book. She doesn't really cover it as much in the first chapter, but I wanted you to understand her science, right? Because the later she talks about very specifically about France, China, and Russia, and we just don't have time to really do that in this first part of the course. We will talk about specific cases later, and we're going to talk about it in the lecture today. And we didn't quite finish the chapters, but I'm going to go back and sort of look at the videos, make sure they're there, and I want to have time for review, and so you're going to have your exam. And then what's going to happen is when we come back next week, normally I would give you some time. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of a break next week. It's not really fair, but essentially as you go into next week, there'll be less, we'll do like one session to sort of account for the time that you were in an exam. Because I don't think it's fair just because you can do an exam take home, right? We'll adjust some time and we'll just see where we're at, but we should be caught up today. So let's talk about this Peters thing, because this is going to be, we've been reviewing this a lot, so I don't feel like we have to spend a ton of time on this. But when we're talking about this logic of comparison, remember this is sort of John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill's a very old author, right? And this, how do we design research? And there's these two things that really come into play in this and in Scotchpole and in everything, as this method of agreement and method of difference, right? Method of agreement and method of difference. Sometimes you want to see what they share, right? That's what Scotchpole is doing. What do these cases share? What are their shared characteristics, right? When we talk about, places that have certain powers, like powerful states, right? Why is it that China is looking to be a superpower and Russia was a superpower when it was the Soviet Union and the United States is a superpower? Some of that's geopolitical. Some of that's the fact that they're just very large countries, right? India could, in time, become one of the great superpowers of the world because it's got the population and the land mass, right? And it's industrializing. Why is it that the UK will probably never be a great power again? Because it's a very small country geographically in its territory. So when we're looking at cases, when we're trying to say, okay, what's similar and what might be the cause of some of these things? What might be the reason why these things have the same outcomes, right? Why do they have the same outcome? What do they share? Or I'm just going to look, I want to look at outcomes and what do they share, and I want to see what they have in common. Because if they have certain things in common, maybe one of those is a cause, right? One of those has a causal relationship. And so that's part of it. Sorry, the camera just keeps moving on its own. It's not really attached to anything. And we'll talk about the good and bad of that as we move forward. And the other part is, okay, I have a case, right, that is different. It doesn't have the same outcome, and I want to know why it's different, right? It doesn't have this thing. We didn't have a social revolution. What was missing, right? And we'll talk about this with Scotchpole. We'll talk about other cases. What didn't exist in this case that led it to not have a social revolution? What didn't exist in this case that means it didn't grow economically? What was missing that was necessary? And we'll talk about this a lot. Sometimes we talk about what's sufficient. That means if it's there, right, it's deterministic. If you have all these qualities, you will have this outcome, right? If you do well on the tests and you do all the work, that's sufficient for an A in this class, right? That means if you do all that, right, you're at an A. In order to get an A, it's necessary that you at least do all the work and take all the tests, right? So necessary doesn't guarantee you an A. Sufficient gets you to an A, right? Necessary and sufficient are different terminology we'll discuss a lot. This other part is the method of concomitant variation. This is where we talk about spurious relationships, and I've talked about this a lot. This is the swimming and ice cream example, right? That we see swimming go up and we see ice cream consumption go up in the summer, right? They both go up. And what you see is because there's a bit of a drag on ice cream sales, that it looks like swimming increases and then ice cream sales increase. Because of the way that market economies work, the people go out and swim, and then, right, the trucks show up, right? They wouldn't be there beforehand. So it would look like, if you were just doing statistical regression, that you're like, oh, when people swim more, they want more ice cream. And then you realize, no, that's nonsense. People swim more and they eat more ice cream in the summer, right? When the temperature goes up, you'll see more swimming and more ice cream consumption. So that's, right, you see they follow the same pattern, but there might be something else. There might be some third variable that's causing that, and that's what we call a spurious relationship. When we think there's a relationship, but it's actually caused by something else. All right, so now when we're doing research design, there are a couple things that Peters really wants us to think about, and we're going to talk about this in every stage. One is you want to maximize your variance in the variables, right? And what does that mean? A dichotomous is a dummy variable, right? Really only has two options. Either a revolution occurred or it didn't occur, right? Only a 1 and a 0. That's not a lot of variance. It's not a lot of difference in the outcome. And so what we would want instead is, okay, how many changes were there? Some integral variable. That's a numbered variable, right? It increases, right? It goes 1, 2, 3, 4. It's integral. Like an integer, right? An integer is 1, 2, 3, 4, whole numbers. We use the language, right, that not an integration, but right, that integral is like very important, which is that it increases. And I think this should be interval. I'm sorry, I'm definitely getting off topic. The next part is this, okay, selection on the dependent variable. We're going to talk about that a lot, right? Geddes thinks this is a sin, this is taboo. Don't select on the dependent variable. But it might be necessary if you want to look at certain cases. If you want to look at places where revolution led to theocracy, a theocracy is a state in which religion sort of runs the government, right? Iran is a theocracy, right? Khamenei is in charge of the religion is in charge of the government, it's a theocracy, right? If I want to study how revolutions lead to theocracies, I need to look at theocracies and say, how did they get there? How did they come into being? How do they occur? And so I might only want to look at theocracies. How did they occur? And then later I want to look at cases where they didn't occur and say, okay, well, what was different? But first I want to look at the cases that matter, right? So sometimes when we're doing comparative research, we want to look at something specific. And that specific thing is quite rare. Revolutions are quite rare, right? Wars are actually quite rare, or they were quite rare. Right? That why it seems like the United States is in a lot of wars. Wars aren't a common occurrence. It takes a lot of resources. So when you have these rare occurrences, sometimes you want to just look at those cases that have those occurrences. The next part is you want to minimize the error variance. And there's going to be two types of error. There's one that's random error. And the part about random error is you do want to narrow it down as much, right? You want to have as little random error as possible. But one of the things about this is that you have that the random error sort of goes to the middle, right? That it might be a little to the left, it might be a little to the right, high, low, but it tends to be sort of mean reverting. And so if you look at all the random error, it tends to not bias the results in one way, right? It just gives you less accurate results, less precision. And so there are ways to limit random error by making more refined models, but we're not as worried about that as we are about systematic error. Hold on. Okay. So when we're talking about systematic error, this is error that is not just a flaw, but it's biased in a specific direction, right? And we're going to talk about this a lot, and I want you to think about a weight scale, right? So you step onto a scale, and you want to know your weight, right? Let's say you're tracking your weight day to day, right? You want to know your weight. Systematic error would be if that scale was set to be 10 pounds heavier, right? Every time you got on that scale, you were 10 pounds heavier, right? Which means that every time that you always looked heavier on that scale. And if you went to an accurate scale, you'd be like, why is my scale and that scale 10 pounds off? That's systematic error, right? That's something that you can really look at where you're like, that's going to continually be error. Now, the reason we worry about systematic error more than random error is because you can't really always control for random error. We don't know why certain things aren't perfectly modeled, right? You're always going to have some random error. But if you have systematic error, it might lead to results that are inaccurate. You might say, oh, every time we have, the economy grow, we have more violence. But if your metric for violence is always higher, right, then you may not have the right relationship there because of that systematic error. You might be biasing your results. Now, there are a couple ways to have systematic error. One is the omitted variable bias. If you are missing a variable that is necessary, one of the things that can happen is that variable will skew the results because it needs to be there. It matters, right? If we're going to be looking at governments, and revolutions, one of the things that we know that you can't really ignore is the economy. You have to know their GDP or their GNP or some measure of their economy. You have to measure their population, right? Because you have to get how large their country is, right? If they have a ton of wealth and a small population, that's different than having a large economy and a large population, right? The average wealth in Kuwait is higher than the average wealth in the United States. But the United States economy is a much more functioning economy, right? And the likelihood that you could have successful economic mobility in the United States is much higher. So we have to include certain variables or our models will be flawed. The other thing is, we've talked about this a lot, is selection bias. If you only look at certain cases, you might be biasing the results. If you only look at allies of the United States, you might see that those countries go to war more than other countries. You might say, well, why are allies of the United States more warful? Because they're allies of the United States, right? That's selection bias, right? The United States is more likely to go to war than other states because it has a larger military, right? You could talk about military-industrial complex, you could talk about other factors, but also it's a great power. So it might pressure other states to ally with it and go to war, right? The Netherlands, right, Denmark, they offered military support, but at one point, I could be wrong, I'm going to say the Netherlands, they had one soldier. They offered one soldier to the Iraq War, right? They were supporting the United States, they were running with the United States because the United States is a great power, but they weren't going to engage in sort of really strong military engagement. And also their military is quite small, right? So you have to look at that selection bias. Now, we want to control for factors that we know are going to happen a lot, right? When you control for certain factors, hold on. One of you in the WebEx, your mic is on. Oh goodness. I can't tell. I'm sorry. I know that's a bit of a distraction, but so one of the things we know, right, is that population matters. We know economy matters. We know a lot of times education matters. The more educated the population, the less likely they are to go to war because they have more to lose, right? They feel like they're more informed, right? They speak more to the government. They're more empowered because usually they have more wealth, right? And they can make greater demands of the government and say, no, we don't want to go to war. You can't do that. And then, of course, religion. Now, every sort of place has a religion, but in certain areas, religion plays a different role, right? If you look at the readings, if you look at the authors who talk about democracies in the Middle East and North Africa, one of the things they talk about is, I've mentioned this before, is this concern about having separation of church and state. What we would call separation of church and state, obviously they would say something else, right? But in the United States and in a lot of Western cultures, right, religion has to be separate from government for it to be a democracy. But that's not really the same value system that you would see in other places, right? That's not the same. And that doesn't mean that they have a theocracy. That just means that they don't have as clear legal cases, right? There are other aspects that exist, right? But religion influences a lot of the culture and the behavior. If you look at places in Western Europe, right, that are not as Catholic, right, the concern about foreign influence is very different, right? If you look at the UK and the United States, right, there was a strong concern about foreign influence because it wasn't Catholic, because it didn't buy into, right, that hierarchy, right? If you know that Catholic, right, the Catholic Church is a hierarchy, right? It goes from the local parish to the Pope, right? The Pope is at the top. Whereas other forms of Christianity don't have that clear hierarchy. So if you're a Catholic, predominantly Catholic country, then you understand that there's some connection to the Pope and some loyalty to the Pope. If you're not a predominantly Catholic country, you're very concerned about divided loyalties. And sort of historically, we know, right, in the United States that Kennedy was the first Catholic to be elected, and he had to prove that his loyalty was to the United States, right? The first 20, right, 30 presidents, right, had to be Protestant or some non-Catholic version of Christianity because of that history of having influence of the Catholic Church, right? So all of those factors tie in when you're talking about a country, and we know we have to control for those things. We know we have to understand the factors that will always influence a case, right? And if we ignore them, that's going to lead to omitted variable bias. All right, so now we're talking about case selection. And so we're going to talk about this a lot, either these newly industrializing or newly industrialized countries. We're going to call them NICs. A couple of the cases that we're going to talk about a lot, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan. I'm not going to talk about this too much, but they're unique for a reason. They do something different. They do this thing called import substitution industrialization. And I'm going to talk about this a few times. Basically, the way import substitution industrialization works is that you have a industry, like textiles. In South Korea, it was textiles. And you suppress the labor, and we'll talk about what that means later, and you use that money to insulate another industry. In South Korea, it was Daewoo Motors, which we'll revisit. And then you sort of use the money that you're getting from textiles by suppressing labor, by not letting them, get unions or higher wages, and then you build up a new industry, and you end up with an industrialized economy because that new industry, what ends up being Daewoo Motors, it's an automobile industry, it allows the rest of the country to sort of develop, right? We want to look at that because that's unique, right? That might be a thing where we're just going to look at these cases. They're very interesting. We want to focus on them. The next part is the universe of cases, right? And then here we have a different perspective, right? With the cases of interest, we say, I like these are interesting, I'm going to look at these 2 or 3 cases. In the universe of cases perspective, what we do instead is we say, I'm going to take all of the cases, all of the countries, all of the states in the world, and then I'm going to start excluding some things. So if I want to look at sort of education and development, right? How a bigger role does education play on economic growth? One of the things I might say is I'm going to exclude former colonies because they have colonial rule, they couldn't grow economically, they have all these ties that sort of put them in dependency, we'll talk about later, right? I might exclude former Soviet states, right? They have a very different version of capitalism, right? They're very concerned, right? So very different behavior. And then Catholic and Muslim states. And this is one of those things that whenever we talk about religion, there's very different behavior. One of the things, if you talk about banking in Muslim states, right, they have specific rules about usury, about interest, right? That often, right, devout Muslims can't charge interest on a loan. And because they can't charge interest on a loan, it's very difficult to have a banking system because it relies on interest on loans, right? So that's incompatible. So when we're talking about economic growth, we have to consider those things, that they just cannot generate interest on loans, and that could be a big part of their economy. And then the last part is this argument by this author, by Dr. C. Wright. He's an author, and he creates this argument where he says, we should just take all the cases. Just take every case and include it in your research. And just shake out everything in your research. Don't try to limit cases first, right? Just sort of come together. And these are 3 different arguments. They're all valid, right? You can take all of these approaches, but they will produce different results. And depending on the results you want, determine how you want to behave. If you want to say, I want this to be as generalizable as possible, you should follow C. Wright's advice and just include every case. If you think that this won't apply to certain places, if you think, okay, right, we know that former Soviet states don't really have any interest in communist parties. They don't want a communist party to be in the leadership role in some of these former Soviet states because they were under communism for a time and they rejected it, right? So we're not going to look at the rise of communism in former Soviet states because it won't have the same impact. It won't have the same behavior. Or we might say, I really care about places that have a lot of remittances, where places where they send a lot of money back to their family. Specifically, where they have a population in the United States, and that population in the United States is sending money back to the countries where they live, right? If I'm worried about that, I'm going to ignore some places. I'm going to ignore the UK. I'm going to ignore most of Europe because there just aren't remittances in high levels. I'm going to look at other places like the Philippines, right, that have high level, and Malaysia, they have high level of remittances. El Salvador, right, and sort of Latin America. The families here in the United States are sending a lot of money to those countries overseas. So I care about those types of cases, and so I can just pick those that have the characteristic that I want, right, and those are all valid cases. So all of these arguments make sense. And the reason why they can come together in sort of competing values is because there's this book called The Structure of Scientific Revolution. It's by Kuhn in 1970. And he talks about how we develop scientific fields. And one of the things about scientific fields is that over time, what you have is you start to develop rules about what can be dealt with in the theories, right? You start to develop theories and you say, okay, this is what it can do. And sometimes when we talk about economists, we talk about boxes, right? You have a box, and if your problem doesn't fit in that box, then you don't care about that problem. And it starts excluding things that you can talk about. And in this epistemic community, you start agreeing on what theories are valid, what theories have merit and explanatory power, and you start formalizing this. Well, one of the things that happens is that as fields become what we call professionalized, right? We're all using the same theories, we're using the same science, we have the same arguments, we're sort of standardizing, we get what's called standard operating procedure. Now, I was in the military, so SOP is sort of a thing that I talk about a lot. But standard operating procedure says, okay, I'm going to do this task, here are these 10 steps, I'm going to follow these steps exactly. That's standard operating procedure, right? I'm going to do the task in the way that it's set out for me. In a scientific field, sometimes we talk about best practices. Now, best practices are not always the best practices, but we call them best practices. We agree on this normative aspect that they're best practices. And sometimes we stop testing them. We start saying, okay, we're just going to assume they're best practices, we're not going to look at them. And then we get into this thing what's called bad ham. And this is an expression I got from a sergeant in the Army. And I apologize. It's a quick story, but it is a sort of narrative. So if it's unclear, I'll go back, but it should be very clear. So a husband asks his wife why she cooks ham a certain way. And the way she cooks ham, she cuts the ends off and she puts it in the oven. And she says, don't question how I bake my ham, I do it the same way my mom does. And so he sees the mom and she's making ham and he says, okay, why are you baking the ham? Why do you cut the ends off the ham before you bake it? And she says, I did this way, my mom did this way. So now he's at the grandma, and he talks to her, and she's making this ham, and none of them say, you can't question it. That's just how you bake ham. You cut off the edges, and then you bake it. And so finally he gets to the grandma, and he says, why are you cutting off the edges on the ham? And the grandma says, well, I have this really small oven, right, for whatever reason. And because I have this small oven, a normal-sized pan and a normal-sized ham won't actually fit in the oven. So I have to cut off the ends to put it in the oven, for it to fit in the oven. But that has been passed down by generation, and now they're what's called functionaries. They're just doing the way it's been done the whole time. They're not critiquing the way it's been done the whole time. And because they're not critiquing the way it's been done the whole time, they have come to these really bad conclusions about the right way to do things, right? They think, no, this is the right way, you can't even question it. When the grandma would say, no, it's not the right way, I'm dealing with the limitations of my oven, right? Very different behavior. So in that case, right, we want to be careful that we're not just being functionaries. And that's what Thomas Kuhn says, well, you're going to act like functionaries, then we're going to start seeing things that are wrong, anomalies, where you're like, well, why doesn't this fit? And then we have to refine the theory. But in his book, The Structure of Scientific Book, he says, well, the community doesn't want to adjust, so you basically have to collapse it and start with a new community, right? So science can have big adjustments where they reject scientific behavior or where they say this is no longer an aspect of science, right? Metaphysics used to be a big part of science. It's not anymore, right? Metaphysics is not science because it's outside the material realm, right? So it's just not part of the scientific world, right? Very awful history in the United States is phrenology, where we used to measure the skulls of African Americans, right, and tell you why they were inferior in some way, right? That's not science, and it's completely debunked, right? But it was at the time, and that scientific community accepted that, right? Phrenology was taught at like Harvard and Princeton and Ivy League schools, and it was completely false. No real merit to it, but it fed into that narrative, right? That sort of racist narrative, and so it stayed around for a long time. And so that's why we always want to say, okay, let me test my assumptions. Let me make sure that I'm not just doing it the way it's always been done, but I'm critiquing it and thinking about the way that it's been done. Okay. The next part is this huge change in the field. Until about the 1990s, everything was sort of regional and parochial, right? The way that China behaved wasn't necessarily the way that the United States behaved. And then you started having this globalization. And what happens, in a very simplified way, is that all the countries can now communicate in real time, right? The internet, right, the sort of connectivity of the world, they can all communicate in real time. The first part that matters is economics. We all want to be on the same page because you don't want to be left out in sort of economic systems. You don't want to be left out in trading, right? If you're on a different stock exchange, you want to engage with the New York Stock Exchange. You want to compare value of the dollar in other places, right? And all of those things, you want to be connected. So you start to sort of have cohesion. And this happens through what's called diffusion. And diffusion, a lot of people talk about like, oh, here's a value, I want you to have this norm, right? If you join the Army, I was in the Army, so this is the example that I have, right? They're like, here are the values that you have, right? You have these leadership values: loyalty, duty, respect, right? Selfless service, honor, integrity, personal courage. Those are your values. That's not diffusion, right? That's indoctrination, right? I don't think anyone would challenge that the Army indoctrinates. It does it on purpose, right? These are the values you're gonna have, I'm gonna demand the money. That is not diffusion. Diffusion is where you interact with other people and you see their values and their norms and you start imitating or emulating their norms, right? One of the things is that in almost all cultures, people hold the door for other people. And very rarely, I mean, maybe when you're raising your children, you say, oh, hold the door for them. But this idea of why you hold the door, that's not something that's discussed. You just hold the door for other people, right? Saying bless you, right? Bless you is this thing that's very, very common. We're not in classrooms right now, but while we're in classrooms, anytime someone sneezes, a lot of people would say bless you. It was a very common thing, right? But historically, the reason they said bless you was some crazy idea that if you sneeze, you had to bless them before demons could get in their head, right? So the reason behind it is lost. Now it's just become this norm that we have. So you have diffusion, you start sharing values. Globalization is when those values start to be adopted by the international systems, right? The UN has really adopted this system where intervention is only for humanitarian reasons. There's a book called Purpose of Intervention by Finnemore. I don't think we will read it in this course, it's more international relations. But this idea that the norm of the UN, the United Nations, is that we don't just go into countries anymore unless it's to help them, right? You can't just invade a country because you want to. There has to be some reason that helps the people there, right? Humanitarian reasons have to be involved in intervention. When you talk about international system in the World Bank, right, you have to have trade rules, you have to have loan rules, right? The World Bank and the IMF started to agree on how loans would go out. If you needed a loan from either of those, they were going to have very similar conditions because they sort of conformed to one thing. The other part is this process of conformity in the international system that exists today. States really have started to coalesce. In Latin America, a lot of the states are presidential systems. They have a president. If you asked a scholar, an Americanist, a constitutional scholar, to go to these countries and to tell them the best type of system they would have, they would say, don't have a president. It's a mess, right? To have a separately elected individual, it becomes a popularity contest, right? People in the United States who are experts who go to other countries say don't have a president. But those places have a president because they want to be like the United States in some cases, right? And so they emulate. Even if the reasons why aren't very good, they still want to emulate that system. And if you look at Japan's constitution, it has a lot from other constitutions that it emulates. Not because it's the best possible answer or the best way to serve the people in Japan, but because they like those things in other countries and they sort of emulate them. And we always worry about that. The other part is the difference between diffusion and institutionalized and internalized norms. This humanitarian diffusion, the argument in all international bodies, international law, is that people have basic human rights. Right to live, right to look for work, this universal right to go out and try to earn and be successful, right? This is something that is in all international systems. But if you looked at most countries, there would not be, among the population, there would not be universal acceptance that everyone has this right. If you look at any country, they have some belief of some population that is very problematic, right? In South Korea, I mean, this is a long time ago, right? But they have a population of people that they don't see at the same level, right? We know India has untouchables, or had untouchables, and whatever argument they want to use there, right? The United States had slavery, it had mistreatment of indigenous populations, right? Every country has this group that say, no, I mean, in the institutions we agree that everyone has this universal right, but in our internal norms, right, the way we feel internalized in our values, it doesn't work the same way, right? So we always want to talk about, yes, it's diffused in the bodies and the governments, but that doesn't mean the people accept it. And that's very important to make that distinction, right? The people might not accept these values, even if the states are conforming to those values. Right. Now let's talk about unit or level of analysis. Now I use the language of unitive analysis. We're talking about what's the unit, what's the thing we're looking at, but level analysis is perfectly acceptable as well. This is a little bit of language, so not being that important. There's a book called Man, State, and War. The text Man, State, and War, Man, State, and War, creates these levels of analysis. Now, the first level is the individual, right? One person. What's one person affected by? The next part is the state, but because I'm an IR scholar, we go person, state. But there are multiple levels in there, right? There's your community and your society, right? What does your small community think about a certain aspect, right? Not just the individual, but sort of a small group. And subnational units, right? Subnational units like Nevada versus Arkansas, or provinces in India, right? Or different states within the Soviet Union during that time period. And the last one is this global, this sort of world level. And what's important is we will get different results based on the unit of analysis that we pick, right? What is the unit of analysis we're discussing? Why does it matter, right? If I'm talking about individuals, I'm going to be talking about perceptions. I'm going to be talking about the way they think and feel about things. If I'm talking about the state level, I'm not going to be thinking about perceptions and the way they think and feel about things. I'm going to be talking about the factors that exist, what kind of institutions they have, what kind of military they have, what kind of economy they have. And it's going to be much more of an objective ontology, right? Remember, ontology, epistemology, and methodology are always going to matter, right? If you look at the state, a state level unit of analysis, right, then you're going to be talking about much more objective realities because they're going to be looking at those metrics. If you look at the individual level, you're going to be much closer to subjective or intersubjective because their perceptions are going to matter. The other part that we sort of get into is this idea of emergent properties. And all this means that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, right? If you look at every part of a car, it does a certain job, right? But no piece of the car makes it a car, right? Each piece does something different, right? The engine produces the power, right? The transmission allows it to transfer that power, right, into whatever the workings of a car is. I don't want to go through the whole thing, and nor do I know exactly every step to get to from the engine to the wheel, right? But there's a transmission of power, right, from the engine to the transmission, right, to the axles, to the wheels, that causes the car to go, right, with a whole host of other things in part. But if you just look at one part, you wouldn't see a car, you would just see one part. The other part is interactions. Sometimes we would say, well, if it rains, we're probably going to see less Democrats. One of the things that we know in the United States is that on rainy days, if an election happens on a rainy day, Democrats are less likely to vote. It's just something that we found over the last few years, right? Over the last few decades, right? That Democrats are just less likely to go out and vote in person when it's raining. But in certain time periods, right, it doesn't matter that it's raining because Democrats are more likely to know that it's going to rain, right? If you look at in Denver, It doesn't matter if it's raining, it's November, right? So everyone sort of adjusted to that weather, and so that interaction changed that. Mitigating factors also matter, right? If you look at a population, specifically a population that's very well off, right? If you look at sort of Kuwaitis or people from Saudi Arabia who are actually in the Saud family, or right, part of that wealthy aspect, and if you look at their behavior, right, outside of the countries they're in, right, if they were to go to another country, their behavior changes dramatically because the mitigating factor is they're in France or they're in Europe or they're in the United States and they're adopting to the social etiquette of those areas, right? That's a mitigating factor, right? So whatever expectations of a Saudi prince, it would occur in their home country, right? We know that, right, the certain crown prince, right, he did a lot of things to sort of garnish power and gather power there, but those behaviors wouldn't be acceptable in the United States and they would change the factors. So we always want to consider how is the interaction of our variables, not just the variables themselves, and do they interact? All right, so now let's talk about some cases. Let's get a little more detailed about this, and let's talk about cases in Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa specifically, right? We're not talking about Middle East and North Africa, which has its own host of issues, right? International involvement, right? The Middle East has a lot of international involvement. Sub-Saharan Africa, on the other hand, has a very little international involvement. It also is exclusively former colonies, right? At one point, all of Africa was under colonial rule. So when you look at their behavior, usually what would happen under colonial rule is you would have elites, local elites, right? So you'd have one part of the population that would work with the colonial rulers during a colonial rule. And when colonization or colonial rule ended, right, after World War II, there was an agreement there would be no more colonial rule. Right? All states were going to be independent. Afterwards, what happened is the same people who used to work with the colonists, the colonizers, right, the colonial powers, right, the UK, France, they became the rulers of those countries, of those states. And so they weren't liked very well because they had always been aligned with the foreign power, and now they were in power themselves. And so the domestic population didn't see them as legitimate. They saw them as continued puppets for a colonial ruler. Right? Great. Formal colonial rule is over, but this neo-colonialism continues because it's the same people who were in charge when we were under colonial rule. So it's very unique to Africa that's not unique to other parts of the world, right? There's just more colonial rule in sub-Saharan Africa. The next part is state formation, and this is something that's quite strange, is state borders in sub-Saharan Africa are very straight, right? If you look, they're very boxy. That is to make it easier for cartographers and for people who are sort of developing these states, because it was designed, right, just, okay, we're just going to make this country a square and this one a rectangle, and that just makes it easier to just set up all the states in sub-Saharan Africa. But that's not how populations live. That's not how ethnic groups break down. And so what you have is some states with a bunch of ethnicities and groups sort of crammed together, right? Not by choice, not by formation of a national identity, they're just forcing. And the other thing that happens is these borders cut groups in half. And there's this article called Dismemberment and Segregation. I know it sounds gruesome. But basically, if your ethnic group is split between a border, your loyalties are split. Are you, right, with the Sudanese, right, group of, if your ethnic group is in Sudan in another country, are you going to ally with the Sudanese, right, or are you going to ally with the people in that country? And depends on how much your power structure is there. And so it's much harder to have a national identity when your ethnic identity is split between different parts, right? We could look at the same thing with the Kurds, right? The Kurds are in Northern Africa, and they're in Turkey, and they're in Syria. And they have a strong national identity. The Kurdish nation has a strong national identity that they really fought to form, but they're in different countries, they're in different states. And so you can't have a Syrian national identity because it's going to exclude the Kurds because they have their own national identity. And in sub-Saharan Africa, right, there's so many different ethnic groups, right? They've been there longer, they've had more time to develop their mythology, more time to develop their beliefs, their culture, their religion, and so they do not coalesce as well because they've been separate and they have not been peaceful this whole time. So there might be animosity between groups and a whole host of other cases. The next part is dependency theory. So one of the things about being a former colony and being where they're at is they have a lot of sort of raw goods, right? Just bauxite is a mineral that they sell, right? agricultural goods, whatever it is, right? They already have trade relations with this core. The core is the global north, this very developed part of the world, the UK, France, Germany, the United States, and Canada. And so what happens is they buy up all these cheap goods, they make some sort of equipment, and they sell it back to the sub-Saharan African states, and they're always at a trade deficit. They always have bad trade relations. And over time, they build up more and more debt, and as they're building up that debt, they have to keep borrowing from the same places that are giving them a bad trade deal. And this is unique, right? All of these things are unique to sub-Saharan Africa, and they matter for those cases, where they matter less for other places. So it makes sense to look at them as individually. And the last part is civic culture. And this one, sometimes we talk about theories, it's problematic because it feels like it's sort of bigoted. But one of the things about a lot of places outside of sort of Western Europe and the United States is what we call parochial belief systems or parochial communities. Now, when you have a parochial lifestyle, that means you only really think about the community and your sort of neighborhood, right? Or your town, right? We're talking about less industrialized, more agrarian societies. And so you're only really connecting with the people that are a 20-minute walk from you, right? It's a small community. And you don't feel connected to the national identity. You don't feel connected to the capital, right? You feel very separated. And you have a belief that your community is not connected, whether through needs or goods or production or anything, to communities in other parts of the country, right? Whereas we struggle with this in the United States, but we live in Las Vegas or the Las Vegas area, right? We don't think that our fate is disconnected from the fate of the people in New York, right? It's not like we still have a pandemic and New York doesn't. We all have a pandemic. Right? It's not like they're in a bad economic spot and we're in a great economic spot. No, we have a shared fate. And that national identity was formed over a long time. Whereas in some places, they still have a parochial identity, right? More individualistic, more about their small community and less about the entire country. And then this other part about civic culture is what we call patrimonial or a patronage system, right? If you get into power, you help the people closest to you. It's not need-based or merit-based, you just help the people. So if you need a secretary of defense, and you become president, you just get your cousin to be secretary of defense. It's patrimonial, right? That not it has to be your family member, but you connect to your group, you bring your group into power. Ethnic group, or not just like ideological group, right? Because obviously conservatives would bring conservatives into power, and liberals would bring other liberals into power. The other part is political or merit-based, right? Who should be the Secretary of Defense? Someone who has an understanding of how defense works, right? A former military representation, or someone who was Secretary of the Army before, some aspect of that. So that's why the cases in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, can be unique, and we can look at specific aspects that exist for those cases that really influence the way we're going to approach the scientific endeavor. All right. So now we're talking about this idea of validity without experiments. Now, I've talked about this before. In hard sciences, what we call natural sciences, right? Chemistry, mathematics, physics, right? They can just run an experiment, and it's clear what is happening, right? They control for everything, only one thing. There's an experiment, one thing changes, right? That's the great thing about an experiment. You say everything else is going to be the same, and I'm going to change one thing. And therefore, whatever happens in the outcome has to be driven by this one thing, because it's the only thing that's different in this experiment. Well, we can't do that, right? We talked about this earlier in the class. It's unethical, it doesn't really work, it doesn't represent the real world, right? So when we're talking about this, we don't have the same approach, but we can still be scientific. We can still have validity. And so the first part is we have to make sure we're clear about what we're measuring. Are we measuring what we think we're measuring? If you're looking at GDP per capita, you're looking at the size of the economy divided by the population. That's just how you get per capita, the size of the economy divided by the population. That's just the size of the economy. If you're saying, well, how poor are people poor in this country? Well, if you just looked at the size of the economy, that's not functional, right? We have billionaires, multimillionaires, billionaires, multi-billionaires now, right? People have $100 billion. So if you look at GDP per capita, that might not give you a good idea of how poor the population is. So you say, okay, I'm going to measure poverty, I'm going to use GDP per capita. That's a bad measure. Instead, you might use a Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is actual measure of inequality. And you might see, is this an unequal place? And that'll show you, is there a lot of poverty and a lot of extreme wealth, right? Poverty and extreme wealth. So that's a better measure. The next part, which I've mentioned already, is internal validity, right? Internal validity is this argument that when I look at a change in X, it causes a change in Y, right? Some sort of calculable, seeable, observable change in Y, right? And we'll talk about this as we go to the further along in the research. But you need to be internally valid. If your argument is not internally valid, none of the rest matters. You have to start with internal validity. I believe this model works in these cases, right? Scotchbull is saying, in the cases that I'm looking at, I believe this model works. Now, is it generalizable to the rest of the world? Geddes would say, no, it doesn't work in the rest of the world, right? I can show you Latin America and it doesn't work. It doesn't work in the real world, right? When we look at all the cases, it doesn't hold. But you don't start with external validity. You always start with an internal validity. Do the arguments make logical sense, and are they represented in the data that you're discussing, right? Internal validity has to be first. So if we're worried about internal validity, let's talk about what are the sources of invalidity. The first is historical context, right? Does your theory, does your logic, does your argument match the historical context? If you're talking about behavior, right, of states, right, in the 1950s, right, you have to talk about it differently than the 1930s and 1940s, because probably around the 1880s to the 1950s, colonial rule was a big aspect of those countries. So if you take 1935 and you say, okay, how does the UK look? Is the UK a great power in 1935? Yes. Right? Is France a great power in 1935? Well, now let's look at 1950. Are they still great powers? UK, no. Right? They're not really great powers anymore. Why? They don't have colonial rule. They can only develop the economies that exist there. Right? In France and the UK, nothing wrong with them. They're just small countries with small populations. They can't compete with the hundreds of millions of people in the United States, the billion people in China, right? The Soviet Union during that time period. They just can't compete economically, right? So you have to treat them differently in those 2 years. If we look at currency, in 1968, the American dollar was very, very stable, because of the gold standard, right? That every dollar was backed. Right? Every $35 had to have an ounce of gold, or whatever the calculation was. That's not relevant. In the 70s, Nixon says no gold standard. Right? The dollar is only going to be worth what we believe it to be worth. Right? The full faith and credit of the United States. Right? So whatever you think the value and the credibility of the United States is, that's the value of the U.S. dollar. And that change is so dramatic that it really starts to matter. Right? You don't have the same behavior. But also, if we look at currency exchanges, right, how much we trade currency, you couldn't exchange currency until the 1970s because the standard, the value couldn't dip below a certain point, right? So you sort of have a pegged value, stuck at that value. Where, right, in the late 70s and into the 80s, suddenly the dollar can have different values every single day. And you can trade your dollars for some other currency, right, rubles or yen or whatever it is, and then you can trade it back and forth and make money just doing that, just exchanging currency day to day. So is the economy bigger after the end of the gold standard? Yes, because you just created a new industry, right? Currency exchange was something that was created at the end of the 20th century that didn't exist before, right? That created a new way to make money in an economy. So that's one way we can look at it. Is this invalid because we're looking at different things? You say, oh, we don't have to worry about the value of the dollar changing, and you're talking about the 1990s. It changed dramatically in the 1990s. That would not fit with the historical context, and it would be invalid, or would have some flaws in the model. The next is selection bias. We're going to talk about this a lot. What are you including? What are you excluding? How does that influence the results? That's the whole thing, so I'm going to skip over that because we're going to talk about it a lot with Scotchbull and Geddes. The next part is instrument bias. I mentioned this, right? Are the authors of the case studies you're talking to, are they consistent? If you were to ask two authors about the same country, right? If you ask two authors about Iran, would they give you the same answers about the government in Iran? That's problematic if they don't. And then the other part we talked about, right? Is your scale calibrated properly? If every time you weigh something, it's off by a certain amount, that's going to bias your results. If you don't know, right? Obviously, if you know that it's tearing the weight of the container or something, there's always that. But if you don't know that it's miscalibrated, then there's an aspect where you have to be very careful. The next part is maturation. So maturation is where you have a case that you're looking at, and something fundamentally changes about that case. Do you just have to ditch it, right? If we were to talk about growing, sort of growing, right, extremism in the executive branch in the United States, we probably couldn't continue that research after this election, right? The executive branch just went through a fundamental change. It had a new presidency, a new political party. You're going to have very, very different behavior. So if you're going to say, okay, over the period from 2016 to 2024, right, what's the extremism? Well, there's a problem. In 2020, right, you had a switch, or in 2021, because it was in January, right, you have a switch of power, of parties in power and their behavior. And if you don't recognize that change in your case, you're going to have some flaws in your research. The last part is this idea of a regression towards the mean. Now, the way a regression towards the mean works is that every time you have a value that's more extreme, right? If you have a really big economic year, right, then in the next year, you're not going to see the amount of growth, right? You have sort of a, right, you have a natural return to the average value, whatever it is. So in comparative politics, in economic terms, right, anytime you have a big year, you're not going to have another big year, right? You typically go back to whatever the average growth rate is over time, right? So if we have a 10% next year, or we're probably going to have a big economic growth this year as we open everything back up, or in 2022, we might have a really big economic year because everything is back up, and we're sort of ramping up the economy and people are free to do stuff. So 2022 might be a much bigger economic year, but then 2023 might revert back to the normal growth rate of the United States. The other part is that the average state in the world is not a democracy, then what we will likely to see is a reversion to autocratic rule or non-democratic rule as we move forward, right? If a bunch of places say we're going to democratize in 1910, they're less likely to stay democracies than if they were to democratize now, because now the most common occurrence, the average, is a more democratic state, right? So that's regression towards the mean. And if we ignore that, and we say, well, it looks like so many countries are democratizing now, well, most of the countries are democracies. The only great power in the world, the United States, is a democracy, so there are financial benefits to becoming a democracy. That doesn't mean democracies are more valuable to those countries. That just means there might be benefits to becoming a democracy outside of the institutions that come with it. All right, so that is Peter's. Let me go right into Scotch Bowl. I'm a little behind, but I think we're going to have plenty of time to one second. I keep forgetting. Just a little slow. Okay. So are there any questions right now? Are there any concerns? We are going to have an exam. We're going to take a break in about like 15, 20 minutes. And then we'll come back at 10 with the other WebEx. But are there any questions right now that you have as I sort of get everything back into place? Okay. So I'm not seeing any questions. Remember, you can always text me. Why is this? We'll see how many people actually take the exam. So after that, I might cater more to the people that are in the class, because who knows how many people will be left. So just sort of adjusting to this process. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Scotch Bowl. And one of the things Scotch Bowl says, you can see the social revolutions file, right? For those of you in the WebEx, you should be able to see the social revolutions PowerPoint. So one of the things about Scotchwell's book is what is a social revolution, right? These are one of the things that comparative politics can really get into, that it has a specialties into. And so the first thing we have to define a social revolution, right? A social revolution is a transformation of the society's state and class structures, right? They both have to change. It can't just be a change from a autocracy to a democracy. It has to be a class structure change as well, right? The working class has to have more benefits. It has to be treated differently after this to be called a true social revolution, right? As opposed to a political revolution, right? A political revolution, you just have a change in the type of government, or you have the change in the institutions. A social revolution includes a change in the class structure. There are a few historical instances. That's why we talk about France, Russia, and China a lot, right? Russia's revolution in the 1917, 1919, they have this revolution where their entire society changes, right? France has a revolution where their entire society changes. The Chinese revolution changes the Chinese world, right? For a long period of time, it was a consistent system, right? Compared to how long the dynasties lasted in China, right? Communism is actually fairly new, even though it's a very old regime compared to other countries, right? Other states, right? This is something that is very different for those aspects. So we're talking about these cases, we're talking about that for social revolution, you have to have political and social change. Now, let's talk about the scientific aspect of the text. What is the scientific aspect? When we're talking about this scientifically, the part that matters is Scotchwell calls this comparative historical analysis, or CHA. And it follows a very specific sort of organization. The first is you select cases. And because we care about social revolution, Scotchwell says, we're going to look at places that had a social revolution. We're not going to look at every place. We're going to look at the places that we care about, cases of interest. Then we're going to do a case study. First, we're going to identify the political and social structures that existed, right? How was society set up? Was the working class a peasantry, a proletariat? Were they laborers or skilled laborers? Were they treated differently? Were they allowed rights? Were they allowed to sort of have autonomy? Were they allowed to behave in certain ways? Did they have supervisors right on top of them? Or did their landlords never show up as long as they paid a certain amount that they was expected, right? Autonomy often occurred in peasantry because the landlords didn't want to come out to the farms, the large tract farms. They said, as long as you produce a certain amount of crops each year, as long as you ship me this many tons of wheat or this many tons of rice, I'm not going to bother you. Just make sure you get this production out. And so even though they were elite ruled, right, for a lot of these places, they just weren't connected, right? So that was the social structure. The political structure was what types of elites were running. Were those elites independent economically? Were they driven by other factors like ethnicity or religion, right? And then we want to identify all the relevant aspects, right? What are the relevant aspects that matter? Now that we know the case and we know what existed to begin with, then we go through process tracing. Process tracing is just this chronological order of events. We put all the events in order and we find these crucial points. This point in time changes the outcome for some reason, right? We've talked about this before, right? If Archduke Ferdinand doesn't die, does that change the outcome of the war, right? Or if there is a really harsh winter, right, the Russian case, right? If there's a really harsh winter during a war, does that change the outcome? Right, one of the things that we know, right, is when Nazi Germany went east into Russia, it was a very harsh winter, one of the harshest winters in a very long period of time, and the Nazis weren't dying because they were losing to the Russian military. They were freezing and starving to death because they didn't understand how to survive in that climate as well, right? And the Russians burned their own towns down to make sure there was no resources to get, and then they cut off their supply lines, right? So process tracing, what are these crucial events, right? If we're talking about that case, right, you have the winter, and then you have the supply line cuts, and that leads to the Eastern forces sort of falling as Russia advances west. The next part is that Scotchwell talks about a structural perspective. And we're going to talk about this a lot in comparative politics. There are two ways to explain how something happens. One is a structural perspective, and the other one's agency. A structural perspective, the way that it works is that you look at the structure, you look at the regimes, institutions, and government, and the class structure, right? Do you have a bourgeoisie? Do you have this independent middle class? Or do you just have elites and peasantry, right? Are you industrializing, right? Are people allowed to vote, right? How does government work? You have this structure. And the structure either influences or dictates behavior. And this is what we call deterministic. Maybe it's not deterministic for all the cases, but it's deterministic in the sense that it's path dependent. If you are in an autocratic society and you are in a society where the landlords are sort of hands off, they don't connect, right? You have this autonomous society, but it's all agrarian and you're peasantry, and there's no really way for you to mobilize, economically mobilize. You can't increase your class, you can't get out of your class or increase your station. You're going to be born a farmer and you're going to die a farmer. But no one's watching you, and then all of a sudden you have some external threat or you have lost legitimacy in your government, then you're going to behave a certain way. That's a structural. It doesn't matter who you are, you're all going to behave as a group in a certain way. This ignores agency. And the simplest way to explain agency is sort of like free will or individual choices. An argument that includes agency is what would people do in those situations? Because people might do different things. A structural argument said, no, there's only so many good options. They would pick among the options that exist in the structural argument because it would limit them, right? And a structural perspective often ties in very well to rational choice, right? If you're starving and you have $1 and you could either, right, go and buy, right, $1 worth of food, or you can spend that dollar, right, to rent a movie, right? Let's just say it's Redbox or something. You're going to buy food, right? Because you're starving. You're going to choose food, right? Obviously, there's concerns about addiction and stuff like that, but normally, if you have very limited resources, you're going to choose food and shelter first, then other things later, right? And obviously, drugs change that outcome, but for the most part, rational people would follow that structure. I only have so much, this I'm going to spend it, right? Agency would be, well, I just won't eat today. This matters more to me, right? Or I know the rational thing to do. I'm going to do something different, or this is more rational to be, right? I'm going to be hungry today, but I really need to get this video because it's instructional. And if I watch it, I'll be able to get better income tomorrow, whatever it is. So then Skocpol discusses the existing theory, right? The first part is this Marxist theory, right? Marxism, if we're talking about Karl Marx, Marx and Engels, right, so the Communist Manifesto, is this argument that the labor class will say, well, the people who own the means of production, the people who own the factories, they're making all this money off of me, right? The work I do, I get a certain amount of it, and the rest goes to the owner. And I don't accept that, right? That's something that I can't accept over time. I'm being disturbed, right? That's inappropriate. And so eventually we sort of gain consciousness that as a group, all of the laborers are being disturbed by the owners of production. And so this will inevitably lead to socialism, where we share the ownership, and we share the means of production, and therefore we're not just giving it all to one person, we're sharing it. It's going to be open after class. Sorry, I had a question about the exam. The exam will be available as soon as this class ends, and then you'll have all week to take it. It's not a timed exam. You'll just have the entire next week before the start of the next class to sort of look at your materials and just give you the best answer you can. And it's just 4 essay questions, and I'm going to give you a lot of feedback about why you got the score you got, and don't stress about whatever score you get. There's a lot of like extra credit, and right. This is really a way for me to test where you're at in understanding the methodology, the epistemology, the ontology, and the science of this field, not as much of like a really weighted exam. So just make sure after class today you look at it, follow the instructions, make sure you give the best answers you can off the material we cover, and then just do the best that you can. And then if you're not hitting the marks that I thought we would hit, then I will talk to you and make sure that everyone has a chance to sort of recover, right? No matter how bad you do on this exam, as long as you actually take this exam, there's no way for it to eliminate you out of an A, right? Everyone can do badly on this exam and still end up with an A in the class. They just have to, I just need this baseline. I was going to delay it, but it'll be available as soon as class ends. I hope that answers your question about the exam, right? That you should see it right after this. So probably like 11:30. It should be available. It should publish. I'm going to publish it right after this class, but who knows how long it takes to show up on your end. And then you'll have all week to look at it. I hope that answers the question. So when we're talking about, we talked about Marxism. Now, right, Scotchwell talks about Ted Gurr. Ted Gurr talks about frustration, right, this idea of frustration. And that frustration leads to violence. And one of the things about frustration leading to violence is that people think, well, it's not just about deprivation. It's not just I'm starving. Ted Gurr talks about, well, I see someone else and they're getting more than me. And because they're getting more than me, I'm upset that they're getting more than me. And eventually you get so upset and your group gets so upset because another group is getting more that you become violent, right? And I mean physically violent. You attack other people and you go straight to that. And Scotchwell is quite dismissive of Ted Gurr's explanation. It's more appropriate for international. It doesn't really fit here about revolution, right? You might become violent, but you may not choose revolution. You might just go and rob someone else. You say, that group has more than me, I'm just going to rob them. The next part is Charles Tilly, right? His argument is everyone's angry. You're angry all the time, right? Everyone's angry about something. Everyone has a grievance. No one's happy about how the government works or disadvantage they get, but they're not organized. And what you really have to have is someone to mobilize you. You need a solution to collective action. You need to not be repressed, right? And repression from the government is where they try and stop you from organizing. And so these are the existing theories about why we might have revolution. And so then we're going to talk about, right, the other theories is sort of how do you prevent a revolution, right? So we've talked about the theories. Now, how do I prevent this? The first part is this resynchronization. So every time a government is worried that they're going to lose out, they change the government, right? We will change the government, right? This is sort of what was called redress of grievances. So if you come to a point where you hate what's going on in the government and there's enough of you to make a stand, a smart government will give you just enough that they stay in power, those individuals or that group stays in power, and stays the government as close to it was before, while also, right, getting you to calm down. Now, why don't they just coerce someone? Why don't they just bring out the fire hoses or the tear gas, right? Because it's only temporary, right? The more that you repress, the less effective it becomes. So repression is not a good long-term strategy. Good, skilled leaders, those are very effective at their jobs, understand that this is the value of legitimacy. If your leaders, if you have faith in your leaders, they can get away with more. They can have more longevity. They can explain to you, right? If you trust them, it'll be easier for them to explain to you why what they're doing is good for you, right? And so faith and legitimacy have a very strong value to this. The other part is this belief that the institutions are fair. Now, there's always been an issue of police brutality in the United States, but most people in the 90s and in the 2000s would say that the government is fair, right? The government is relatively fair. Not that it's good, not that it's functioning well, but that the government itself, the way that laws are passed, don't necessarily, on the federal level, right? States have their own problems. But on the federal level, the laws that are being passed typically apply to everyone in the same way, right? Now, we have to look at cultural and historical context, right? Every time we say, okay, the society agrees, what do we mean by that? Now, obviously, right, in the 1820s, white males, the society was very fair. But if you weren't a white male, right, then it wasn't fair. But when we look at it in historical context, we'd argue, well, for that time period, under those conditions, it was somewhat fair for that time period, unacceptable as we move forward, right? Now, if we look at today, right, we're going to say, well, we've made a lot of progress. We've made a lot of progress in these things. But if we go to 2050, 2060, we're going to look back and say, look at all of these things that were wrong. In this cultural, in today's cultural and historical context, this is a somewhat fair institution that exists, right? And we have to look at it at the time period in which it existed. Because anytime you look before like 1970, you're going to see mostly discrimination. So it's hard to tell what is fair. If you were to take everything and say, no, that's not fair, that's not a very scientific approach because you have to have variance, right? You have to have differences. You can't just put them all in one category, right? Some are more fair, less fair. None of them as fair as institutions that can exist today, but relative to their time and their culture. Okay. I am starting to run out of breath, so here's what I'm going to do. I am going to end this stream. I know there's a delay on this, but I'm going to end the stream. I will pick up a new stream, and let's say 9:55, I'm going to come back, because it's going to take a few minutes for everyone to get it and everything. But from now until 9:55, we're going to shut down. For those of you that are in the WebEx, I'm going to shut that down as well, because it's going to trigger this thing where if I don't open the other one, it won't work very well. So for both of you, you're going to see a break, but from now until 9:55, just take a break. I'll catch my breath, go to the bathroom, and get ready, and then we'll pick back up, and I should be able to get to the last part, and then we'll go right into review around 10:30. In the last half hour, I'll give you a real clear idea of what I want from the exam.